The desert was not just an expanse of sand, it was a sentence. Imagine walking for days with the sun fixed above you like a burning eye, and realizing there is not a single place where you can hide. Not a tree, not a rock tall enough, not even the shadow of a passing cloud. In the ancient world, where travelers moved slowly and depended on the mercy of nature, this absence of shade was more than discomfort. It was torment. To go days without seeing a shadow meant living under an endless punishment, as if the sky itself had conspired to strip men of their strength, their patience, and their sanity. You survived this desert journey with me, you deserve a medal. But since I don't have one, just hit subscribe and type in the comments, "I'm still alive." So we know you made it. The human body craves relief. It begs for even the smallest patch of darkness where it can rest, cool itself, and recover from the burning assault of the sun. But in the great deserts of antiquity, this relief did not exist. The sands stretched out in every direction, reflecting the heat back into the air so that the very ground seemed to breathe fire. Ancient writers described it as a place where the horizon melted, where your eyes would blur and you would see visions that were not there. Water, palm trees, the promise of shade that dissolved the moment you chased it. These mirages were not harmless illusions. They destroyed men from within, making them run into the distance, exhausting their strength for nothing. Travelers who crossed these wastelands knew that the lack of shadow was not only a physical problem, but also a weapon of the desert against the mind. After days without darkness, even when night finally arrived, people could still feel the sun burning in their skin and see it behind their eyelids. Sleep was shallow and disturbed because the body had no memory of safety. The desert stripped people of the natural rhythm of life, leaving them trapped in a cycle where time itself became unbearable. For the ancients, shade was not just comfort, it was survival. Whole caravans were organized around the rare chance of finding a boulder, a dry riverbank, or even the wall of a ruined structure where they could rest at midday. Imagine dozens of men, women, and animals huddling in the thin shadow of a single rock, fighting for a sliver of relief, while the rest of their bodies remained under the fire of the sun. Some texts from the Near East mention travelers who would fall to their knees and kiss the shadow of a ruined pillar as if it were a gift from the gods. That is how sacred it was to them. The absence of shadow meant every step had to be calculated. It meant the difference between marching during the cruel light of day and daring the dangers of the night. Many caravans chose to travel in the hours before sunrise and after sunset, moving slowly under the stars, because to march under the full blaze of daylight was to invite collapse. Yet even those strategies were not always enough. The heat accumulated in the sand, and when morning came, it radiated back into the air, turning the ground into a furnace that burned the feet of both men and animals. But perhaps the cruelest truth of all was that this endless exposure marked people permanently. Ancient skeletons found along desert trade routes show signs of dehydration, heat stroke, and damage to the eyes from constant exposure to the sun. Travelers often wrapped their heads with layers of cloth, leaving only a narrow slit for the eyes, but even that protection was fragile. The desert found its way into every gap, every weakness. It was relentless, and the absence of shadow was its first and most merciless weapon. And yet men and women returned to these deserts again and again. Merchants, pilgrims, armies. They all knew the risk, but the promise of what lay beyond was stronger than the fear. Spices, gold, sacred sites, or the lure of new lands pushed them to step into a place where the sun allowed no mercy. They entered knowing they would be tested, that their bodies would cry out for the shade of a single tree they would never see. This reality left a deep scar in ancient culture. In many traditions, shadow became a symbol of divine protection, while the desert sun was seen as punishment or trial. To walk without shadow was to be exposed before heaven and earth, naked to both gods and men. And so every time a caravan ventured into that endless brightness, it carried not only its goods but its prayers, hoping that one more day under the merciless sky would not be its last. And as the desert tightened its grip, the body began to feel other punishments, ones that did not depend only on the absence of shadow, but on the ground itself, where every grain of sand held a new torment. The ground itself was alive with fire. Every step taken across the desert was a test of endurance, and the sand was not the soft golden powder we imagine from paintings or modern travel posters. It was sharp, blistering, and merciless. Under the burning sun, it transformed into a bed of coals, radiating heat that punished anyone foolish enough to walk barefoot or with worn-out sandals. In the ancient world, leather footwear was often thin and quickly eroded by the constant abrasion of sand. Soon enough, even the most seasoned travelers found their soles scorched, their skin cracked and bleeding, leaving behind a trail of pain with every footprint. But it wasn't only the feet that suffered. The desert had another way of attacking, through the eyes. Blinding brightness reflected off the endless sea of sand overwhelming the human gaze. Ancient accounts tell of soldiers and merchants forced to squint against the blinding glare, their eyelids swollen and their eyes bloodshot, until vision itself became a torment. Some wrapped thin veils over their faces, cutting the light just enough to walk without going blind. Others used ointments made from animal fat or herbs to soothe their damaged sight. yet nothing could fully protect them. The desert's brilliance was like a sword that sliced into the eyes, leaving men stumbling as if drunk. And then came the storms. When the wind rose suddenly, the ground itself would take flight, turning into clouds of cutting particles that struck skin and eyes like burning needles. Sandstorms could strip caravans of their direction, scatter animals, and bury entire paths beneath shifting dunes. Those caught in them learned to wrap their faces tightly, to press their bodies against the earth, and to pray. Because in those hours, even the strongest warriors were reduced to helpless creatures, blinded and whipped by a storm of dust. There are stories from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia of armies, halted not by the sword of the enemy, but by the fury of the desert wind. Thousands of men could vanish into a storm, re-emerging days later as shells of themselves, their eyes permanently damaged, their bodies scarred by sand. And yet, what truly broke men was not always the violence of the storm, but the quiet cruelty of walking day after day on burning ground. Imagine the journey of a slave, forced to carry heavy jars of water, his bare feet sinking into the hot surface, each step feeling like punishment. Or the merchant who, after weeks on the road, found the leather of his sandals disintegrating, leaving him to march with layers of cloth tied desperately around his feet. There are fragments of texts from Greek travelers who describe men collapsing because their feet had literally cooked from underneath, the skin peeling away in the heat. This was no exaggeration. The desert punished not only the weak, but even the well-prepared, because time itself wore down every protection. Curiously, desert peoples developed strategies to endure what others could not. Nomads knew how to wrap their sandals with additional leather, how to walk during the hours when the sand cooled slightly, and how to rest in shallow dugouts that gave shelter from wind and glare. They trained their bodies to withstand the brightness by keeping their eyes half closed, never staring directly at the horizon. Even so, they too bore the marks of the desert, skin thickened like bark, eyes that aged faster than their years, and a gait that betrayed the pain carried in their souls. The eyes, in particular, carried an almost mystical weight in desert cultures. Blindness was one of the greatest fears of the traveler. To lose sight in that wasteland meant not only death, but abandonment, as no caravan could afford to wait for a man who could not move forward. Ancient healers sometimes applied mixtures of honey and resin to calm infected eyes, and there are records of Egyptian soldiers carrying small pouches of kohl, the black pigment, which they believed shielded them from the burning reflection. Whether it truly helped or not, it gave them hope. And in the desert, hope was as important as water. But the desert did not stop at feet and eyes. Its cruelty extended to the most vital resource of all. While men stumbled with burned souls and blinded gazes, they knew that what awaited them was an even sharper torment, one that no veil or sandal could protect against. It was the slow, calculated rationing of water, where every drop became more precious than gold, and every sip carried with it the fear of running dry. Water was the one element that ruled life and death in the desert. In the ancient world, men could lose their sandals and still crawl forward. They could endure blinding light and keep moving. But without water, no caravan, no army, no pilgrim would survive. Every traveler knew that their journey depended on skins of water strapped to the backs of camels or carried in heavy jars. Those skins were watched with the same devotion that warriors guarded their swords, for they were not simply vessels, they were the heartbeat of the caravan. A single puncture, a single leak in the leather could condemn dozens of people to death. Rationing was both an art and a nightmare. Leaders of caravans often counted every drop, pouring water into small wooden cups and ensuring that no one dared to take more than their share. One man's greed could doom the rest, and in the desert, justice was swift and merciless. Stories survive from traders on the incense route who punished thieves not with execution, but by abandoning them to the sand with no skin of water. It was a death slower and more terrible than the sword. And so, around the fire at night, travelers whispered warnings and mothers taught their children to sip water as if sipping life itself. The desert played cruel tricks on the thirsty. The body, drained by heat and exhaustion, began to betray itself. Lips cracked and bled. The tongue swelled, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. Men began to dream while awake, seeing fountains and streams ahead, chasing illusions that pulled them off the path. Ancient writers called it the madness of thirst, a fever of the mind where the desperate drank sand believing it was water. Entire groups could vanish chasing a mirage, their bones later discovered miles away from the trade road, scattered and bleached by the sun. But there were also miracles. Hidden beneath the dunes or between rocks lay the oases, those rare pockets of life where palms grew and water shimmered in pools. For the ancients, reaching an oasis was more than survival. It was a rebirth. Merchants arriving at places like Palmyra or Siwa after weeks of suffering often wrote that the sight of trees swaying in the heat haze brought men to their knees in tears. There, water was not rationed. It was celebrated. People bathed their cracked skin, let animals drink until they collapsed and filled their skins again, knowing the desert would demand the same torment soon enough. These oases became not only lifelines but sacred places. Temples rose near them, offerings were left for the gods, and entire cities grew around their waters. turning wastelands into crossroads of civilization. The value of water shaped every decision of desert travel. Armies that marched with overflowing cisterns could conquer, while those who miscalculated perished without ever facing the enemy. Alexander the Great, during his march through the Gedrosian desert, lost thousands not to battle but to thirst. Chroniclers tell of soldiers who, upon finding a small helmet full of water, poured it into the sand in front of him, swearing loyalty by denying themselves the drink. It was not simply devotion to their leader, it was recognition that in such moments, water became a language of sacrifice and survival. Even in smaller caravans, rituals surrounded the act of drinking. Some cultures demanded that the youngest or weakest drink first, others that leaders sip last, proving their honor. There were also warnings etched into memory. Never waste water to wash when others could drink, never pour it on the ground without reason, and never forget where the last well stood behind you. Wells themselves became legendary, some known by name for centuries, others guarded by tribes who demanded tribute for access. Travelers risked battles not for gold, but for the right to lower a rope into the dark mouth of a well and hear the echo of life rising in a bucket. But water had its dangers too. Stagnant pools could carry disease, and animals often fought humans for access. Imagine arriving at a rare spring only to find lions crouched in its shade or snakes gliding across the surface. To approach was to risk your life, yet to turn away meant certain death. This constant gamble marked the rhythm of ancient desert journeys. Every sip tasted not only of relief but of fear, because you never knew when it would be your last. And in this fragile balance between life and death, while men clutched their skins and prayed for clouds that never came, they faced yet another enemy, one that walked on two legs with weapons in hand, waiting for the perfect moment when thirst had already weakened the weary traveler. That enemy did not strike from the sky or the sand, but from the shadows of the horizon, men who hunted men, biding their time to attack the caravans when they were most desperate. Not all dangers in the desert came from nature. The burning sun, the shifting dunes, the thirst that gnawed at the body, those were merciless, but they were blind. Human enemies, however, were cunning, and in the ancient world, one of the greatest terrors of crossing the desert was the constant fear of bandits. The trade routes that carried gold, spices, silk, incense, and salt were arteries of wealth. And where there was wealth, there were always men ready to spill blood to seize it. Caravans were tempting targets, slow and vulnerable as they trudged across open plains with animals laden with goods. The merchants, pilgrims, and even soldiers traveling together often moved in large groups, not out of preference, but out of necessity. Safety was in numbers, because a small company could be wiped out in a single raid. Ancient chronicles describe how bandits would watch from rocky outcrops or dunes, their silhouettes hidden against the horizon, waiting for the caravan to reach its weakest moment, when animals stumbled, when water was scarce, when men were too tired to lift their weapons. The attacks were swift and merciless. A cloud of dust on the horizon could mean salvation or death, because bandits often disguised themselves as fellow travelers. They would approach pretending to be traders, sharing food or news, until, in a sudden turn, swords were drawn and the slaughter began. Some raiders came in small groups, striking like wolves, grabbing what they could before vanishing into the sand. Others arrived like armies, overwhelming caravans with sheer numbers, killing guards, stealing camels, and leaving survivors stripped and bound under the sun. For many, dying by thirst was less terrifying than falling into the hands of desert raiders. Yet these bandits were not always the faceless villains of ancient stories. They were often tribesmen pushed into raiding by scarcity, nomadic groups who knew the desert better than any merchant could. Their knowledge of hidden wells, secret passes, and the behavior of caravans gave them a deadly advantage. Some even developed reputations, names whispered across regions as warnings. Merchants would alter their routes, adding weeks to their journey, simply to avoid the hunting grounds of certain clans. Tribute was another way to survive. Wealthy traders often paid local groups for safe passage, turning enemies into uneasy protectors. But these bargains were fragile, and betrayal was never far away. Curiously, some of the greatest empires of the ancient world rose on the backs of this very danger. The Nabateans, for instance, who built the magnificent city of Petra, began as raiders of caravans moving between Arabia and the Mediterranean. Over time, they transformed their mastery of the desert into a system of control, offering safe passage in exchange for tribute, turning what was once robbery into organized taxation. This evolution shows how closely the desert's violence and its commerce were intertwined, how survival often depended not only on courage but on negotiation and alliances. For travelers, every night was filled with tension. Fires were kept low so as not to reveal positions, guards walked in shifts, and animals were tied close together to prevent them from being stolen in silence. A sudden bark of a dog or the echo of a camel's cry in the dark could send waves of panic through a camp because everyone knew how fast a raid could unfold. One moment the desert was still, the next it erupted into chaos, blades flashing, animals stampeding, and shouts drowned by the wind. The desert amplified fear because there was no refuge. There were no walls to retreat behind, no forests to hide in, no rivers to block an enemy's advance. Just open ground, where the stronger dictated fate. What made these raids even more brutal was the desert itself. To be stripped of your water, your sandals, your animals, and left behind under the merciless sun was a cruelty worse than execution. Survivors often died slowly, their last hours spent crawling on sand too hot to touch. This was why raiders were feared not only for their violence, but for the aftermath of their attacks. A caravan that lost its supplies rarely continued. It scattered into the desert like grains of sand, each man doomed to fade into nothing. But danger did not always wear the face of another man. For even in moments when raiders spared a caravan, or when no enemies appeared on the horizon, there were predators that required no swords or ambushes. They lived within the sands themselves, slithering, burrowing, prowling, creatures that saw weary men as easy prey. And, unlike raiders, these hunters gave no warning, no negotiations, only sudden strikes when the desert night grew cold. The desert did not belong only to men. It was home to creatures that had adapted over centuries to the cruelty of its climate, animals that could survive where humans struggled to last a single day. For the weary traveler, these creatures were not simply part of the landscape. They were lurking threats, predators waiting in silence for a moment of weakness. To march through the sand was not only to fight against thirst and heat, but also to risk becoming prey in a world where the balance of survival tilted against you. The first danger came from the ground itself. Scorpions, almost invisible against the sand, slipped into the folds of tents, the seams of saddlebags, or even the open mouths of waterskins during the night. Their sting could paralyze a man, swelling his limbs and leaving him writhing in pain under the unrelenting sun. Caravans often told stories of men who reached for their sandals in the morning, only to scream as a hidden scorpion struck, sealing their fate before the journey even began. Desert nomads developed habits that seemed obsessive to outsiders, shaking every piece of clothing, turning over bedding, even inspecting their shoes with sticks. But these rituals were born of survival. Then there were the snakes. Vipers and asps, their bodies disguised in the dunes, slid silently across the paths of caravans. Some coiled beneath rocks during the scorching day and emerged at dusk when men and animals sought rest. One bite was often enough to doom a traveler, and without knowledge of herbs or a healer nearby, the venom spread with terrifying speed. Ancient texts describe men foaming at the mouth, their breathing shallow, as companions tried in vain to cut the wound or suck out the poison. Fear of snakes became part of the culture of the desert. Amulets were worn, prayers were whispered, and certain tribes carried charms of bone or copper, convinced they could repel the creatures that haunted their nights. But not all threats were small. Larger predators stalked the trails, drawn to the smell of livestock and the weakness of men. Hyenas circled camps, their haunting cries echoing through the night, unnerving even the bravest guards. They were cunning scavengers, bold enough to snatch provisions or drag away unattended animals. Lions, too, prowled the edges of desert routes, especially in regions where savannas merged into arid lands. To encounter a lion in the night, when torches flickered low, was to feel a terror older than civilization itself. Ancient accounts from Egyptian soldiers describe how they lit circles of fire around their camps, not only to warm themselves, but to keep predators from crossing into their fragile refuge. Even camels, essential allies in desert travel, were not immune to danger. Packs of wolves sometimes shadowed caravans, waiting for a camel to weaken and fall. Once the animal collapsed, the pack descended with ferocity, tearing into flesh while travelers watched helplessly, unable to fight both hunger and predators at once. Losing a camel meant more than losing cargo. It meant losing a lifeline to survival, for those beasts carried the very water and goods that made the crossing possible. Every howl in the distance reminded the travelers that they were not masters of the desert, but intruders in a land ruled by patient hunters. There was also a more insidious threat: insects that thrived in oases and temporary camps. Swarms of biting flies could torment men and animals alike, spreading disease and infection. In some regions, ticks buried themselves into the skin of camels, weakening them slowly until they could no longer carry their burdens. A caravan leader had to be more than a trader or warrior. He had to be a constant guardian against the invisible enemies that struck without warning. The desert taught harsh lessons, that survival was not only about finding water or escaping raiders, but about respecting even the smallest creatures capable of bringing down the strongest man. What made all of this more terrifying was the unpredictability. Raiders could be anticipated with scouts. Thirst could be planned for with careful rationing. But an animal could strike at any moment, turning a quiet night into chaos. Imagine the silence of a caravan resting under the stars, the crackle of a small fire, when suddenly the scream of a man pierced the night because a serpent had slid into his bedding. Panic spread faster than the venom itself, for fear is as contagious as disease. These moments reminded every traveler that the desert was not empty, but alive, and it was watching. And so, travelers adapted. They set traps at the edges of their camps, drove stakes into the ground to tie animals close, and even trained dogs to alert them to approaching predators. Still, no amount of preparation erased the unease. Every shadow carried menace. Every gust of wind might conceal a hiss or a growl. The desert tested not only the body, but also the mind, wearing away courage until even the strongest men jumped at the brush of sand against their ankles. Before the sand buries this video forever, click subscribe and confess in the comments. Would you last one day out here, or would you cry before lunch? Yet, for all these dangers, there was one that no blade, charm, or ritual could truly defeat: the relentless heat itself. For while men might fight raiders, avoid snakes, and guard their water, they could never escape the fire of the sun, which killed more surely than any predator. And when the body began to collapse under that heat, thirst and hunger became secondary. The desert consumed life not with claws or venom, but with an invisible fire that turned strength into weakness and hope into ashes. The desert was a place of contradictions, and none was more cruel than the shift between day and night. If the daylight was an open furnace, searing every inch of exposed skin, the night was a tomb of cold silence. It was not a gentle coolness, but a brutal drop, a fall from one extreme to another, as if the desert mocked those who survived the sun by handing them over to the teeth of frost. Ancient travelers often said that the desert had two weapons: the fire of day and the ice of night, and neither spared the weak. The heat killed with slow precision. Under the sun, the air itself seemed to vanish, leaving nothing but a suffocating weight pressing down on the chest. Sweat evaporated before it could cool the body, and what little moisture remained on the skin was stolen by the relentless wind. Men collapsed without warning, their faces pale and lips cracked, their hearts beating too fast to sustain them. Heat stroke was not understood in the language of science then, but it was feared with the same reverence as a curse. Once a man began to stagger and lose sense of direction, the desert had already claimed him. Stories tell of warriors on long marches who seemed strong in the morning, only to fall lifeless by noon, their bodies so dry that even the flies abandoned them. But when the sun dipped and the horizon burned red, another trial began. The sand that had scalded bare feet all day now released its stored heat into the air, and as the hours passed, the warmth escaped into the void above. By midnight, the desert floor was as cold as stone, and the wind became a knife, slicing through thin robes. Those who had no blankets, no firewood, no protection, trembled until their teeth cracked. Fingers grew stiff and bodies weakened further, unable to rest because the cold gnawed constantly at them. A man who had survived thirst and heat by day could be undone by shivering through the night. Caravans learned to prepare for this cycle of punishment. Fires were built from whatever scraps of wood could be found: thorn bushes, dry roots, even animal dung. At night, whole groups huddled around these fragile flames, wrapping themselves in cloaks and pressing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, because warmth was stronger when shared. Yet wood was scarce, and every piece burned meant another weight carried across miles of endless sand. Sometimes, caravans had to decide whether to use the last bundles for warmth or to save the strength of camels by throwing them away. Choices like these revealed how the desert never gave without demanding something in return. The cold was more than physical. It carried silence, the kind of silence that made men question their courage. During the day, there was noise, the cries of animals, the shuffle of footsteps, the wind sweeping grains of sand. At night, the desert became so still that even breathing sounded loud. Into that silence crept fear. Fear of raiders, fear of predators, fear of the unknown shapes beyond the firelight. Some travelers described hearing voices in the wind, whispers they could not explain, as if the desert itself mocked their vulnerability. For those on long journeys, sleepless nights were as dangerous as thirst. Fatigue dulled their senses, made them stumble the next day, made them careless in rationing water or watching for threats. And yet, despite its cruelty, the cold nights were sometimes embraced as a time of movement. Armies and caravans often chose to travel by moonlight when the ground was firmer and the air more bearable. The stars themselves became guides, their patterns memorized by desert peoples who could read the sky like a map. Under the night's chill, men marched further than they ever could under the blazing sun, but this choice came with a price: exhaustion that grew heavier with every sleepless cycle. To march in the night was to steal strength from tomorrow, and eventually the body demanded repayment. What the ancients feared most, however, was not only the drop in temperature, but the combination of heat by day and cold by night. The constant shock weakened even the strongest bodies, breaking immune defenses, leaving travelers prone to fevers, infections, and a slow wasting away that no healer could cure. The desert, in this sense, was not content to kill quickly. It often preferred to grind life down gradually, stripping away vitality until men became husks, unable to fight, unable to hope. And in that fragile state, when the human body was caught between fire and ice, it became most vulnerable to yet another danger. For while nature punished without intent, there were enemies who waited, watching from afar, ready to strike when exhaustion and exposure had reduced a caravan to easy prey. The true terror of desert travel was not only the extremes of climate, but the knowledge that human eyes might already be fixed on you, planning to take everything you carried the moment your strength was gone. The desert stripped men of their strength, but it also stripped them of their safety. For where the land was harsh, human cruelty found its greatest opportunity. If the heat and the cold were weapons of nature, the bandits who prowled the trade routes were the sharpened blades of desperation and greed. To cross the sands in antiquity meant living under the constant suspicion that someone, somewhere beyond the dunes, was watching you. A caravan might travel for days in silence, only to see, on the horizon, a faint line of figures emerging from the shimmer of heat, their intentions hidden until it was too late. These raiders were not random wanderers. Many belonged to tribes who survived not by farming or trading, but by attacking those who did. They knew the deserts better than anyone. They could move through the dunes without leaving tracks, hide entire groups behind ridges, and ambush a caravan with precision. Ancient accounts from Mesopotamia, Arabia, and even Roman writers describe how these bandits struck like storms, sudden, violent, and overwhelming, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Their knowledge of hidden wells gave them endurance no caravan could match, for while merchants rationed every drop, raiders could strike knowing exactly where to replenish their supplies. The wealth carried through deserts made these attacks inevitable. Incense from Arabia, spices from India, gold and ivory from Africa, all of it passed through fragile chains of camels and men. To a bandit, a single successful raid meant riches beyond anything the desert alone could provide. They took not only goods, but animals, weapons, and even people. Slavery was a grim reality of desert raids. Captives who survived were sold in distant markets, their names erased as quickly as their freedom. For those left behind, stripped of their water and camels, the desert itself finished what the raiders began. Caravans developed strategies to defend themselves. Guards were hired, armed with spears and bows, often positioned at the flanks and rear. Some merchants traveled in massive convoys, dozens of camels strong, believing that sheer numbers would deter attackers. At night, camps were set up in circles, animals tethered inside, fires placed at the edges to create an illusion of strength. Yet no amount of preparation erased the dread. Raiders often attacked at dawn when men were groggy and visibility low, or at dusk when shadows stretched long and confusion spread easily. One wrong move, one broken line of defense, and the desert floor became littered with bodies. Curiously, not all encounters ended in blood. Some tribes realized that perpetual raiding made enemies of everyone, so they offered something like a contract, safe passage in exchange for tribute. Merchants paid tolls in goods, gold, or water, and the same tribes that once ambushed them now acted as guides or protectors. This fragile arrangement blurred the line between raider and ally. The Nabateans, who later built the stone city of Petra, are thought to have begun as such guardians and opportunists, transforming their knowledge of the desert into political and economic power. In this way, banditry was not only a threat, but also a foundation for the growth of kingdoms. Still, betrayal was never far. There are stories of caravans who paid their tribute only to be slaughtered anyway, their goods too tempting for raiders to resist. Trust was scarce in the desert, and every deal was made under the shadow of suspicion. Leaders of caravans carried not just wealth, but responsibility for lives, forced to decide whether to pay, to fight, or to gamble on speed and secrecy. These choices weighed heavier than the sand, for one misjudgment could doom hundreds. The psychological toll of living under constant threat was immense. Imagine marching for days, each gust of wind raising dust that might conceal horsemen, each distant cry of an animal mistaken for the signal of an ambush. Even when no attack came, the fear gnawed at men, slowing their pace, draining their morale. The desert was a battlefield of nerves as much as swords, and bandits knew this. Sometimes they did not strike at all, but followed caravans from a distance, letting exhaustion and fear weaken their prey until resistance seemed hopeless. Yet the most haunting aspect of these encounters was the way the desert amplified the cruelty. If raiders did not kill, they often stripped survivors of food, sandals, and water, leaving them alive but condemned to die slowly under the sun. To perish from thirst after being spared by an enemy was a fate many described as worse than the sword itself. In the eyes of ancient travelers, it was as if the desert and the raiders worked hand in hand, one softening the prey, the other delivering the final blow. But even beyond the cruelty of men, there were dangers in the desert that struck without planning, without greed, without warning. For while bandits could be bribed or avoided with cunning, the creatures that lived in the sands obeyed no treaty, no fear, and no mercy. They waited in silence, patient and invisible, until the night grew deep and the fire burned low. Then, as men huddled together for rest, another kind of terror would emerge, reminding everyone that the desert belonged not only to man but to the beasts that called it home. The desert was never empty, though to the untrained eye it seemed nothing but sand and silence. Beneath that deceptive stillness, life thrived in forms both small and terrifying, and for those who dared to cross these lands in antiquity, animals were as deadly as thirst. They stalked the paths of caravans, slithered into camps at night, and tested the limits of human endurance in ways that the heat and the raiders could not. For a traveler already weakened by sun and exhaustion, the strike of a creature could be the final blow. Scorpions were the most insidious enemies. Their small size made them nearly invisible, and their venomous sting was feared as much as the blade of a bandit. At night, they crept into sandals, crawled beneath blankets, or hid in water skins, striking unsuspecting victims when morning came. Ancient nomads had rituals for survival. They shook every piece of clothing, turned bedding upside down, and taught children from the earliest age to fear the smallest movement in the sand. Some desert tribes even sang lullabies warning of the scorpion, embedding vigilance in the minds of their young. A single sting could swell a limb and turn strong men into helpless burdens for their caravan. Without healers or remedies, many died slowly, their cries echoing into the vastness of the desert night. Then came the snakes. Vipers and asps blended perfectly with the sand, their patterns indistinguishable from the ripples of the dunes. These predators waited until dusk, when travelers finally stopped for rest, to strike at the warmth of human bodies. Ancient texts recount scenes of terror, soldiers bitten in their sleep, pilgrims waking to find serpents coiled in their tents, and frantic companions trying to cut open wounds or suck the poison, desperate to save their friends. In Egypt, men lined their eyes with coal, not only for the sun's glare, but as part of rituals believed to ward off evil, including snakes. Amulets carved in the shape of cobras were carried like shields against the creature's silent wrath. Still, superstition could not halt venom, and the desert claimed its toll. Larger predators haunted the nights with their cries. Hyenas, cunning scavengers, crept close to camps, their laughter-like calls piercing the silence and breaking men's resolve. They stole food, dragged away the weak, and tormented caravans already on the edge of collapse. Wolves followed in shadows, waiting for camels or donkeys to falter, circling like grim shadows of death until the exhausted animal collapsed. Lions, once more common in parts of North Africa and the Middle East, prowled desert edges, their presence so feared that entire armies lit rings of fire around their camps to keep them away. The roar of a lion in the night was enough to silence every voice, every whisper, leaving men gripping their spears with white knuckles as they prayed for dawn. Even the animals that travelers depended on could turn into dangers themselves. Camels, though vital for survival, were unpredictable. In moments of stress or thirst, they could lash out violently, biting or trampling those trying to control them. There are records of caravans losing men not to raiders or beasts, but to their own panicked animals during storms or raids. Horses, though faster, fared worse under the desert's cruelty and often collapsed, becoming bait for predators that stalked the edges of camps. Every living creature in the desert carried both necessity and danger, making survival a balance between trust and fear. And then there were the insects, the smallest yet most relentless of all. Swarms of flies descended on open wounds, spreading infection. Mosquitoes at rare oases carried diseases that weakened already fragile bodies. Ticks buried themselves into camels' skin, slowly draining their strength until the beasts could no longer carry their burdens. Ancient caravan leaders knew that it was not always the grand battles or the terrifying predators that ended journeys, but the accumulation of small bites, infections, and fevers that wore men down day by day. Survival demanded constant vigilance, even against the enemies too small to see in the firelight. These dangers were not confined to the wilderness alone. Wells and oases, the very places travelers prayed to reach, were often guarded by creatures who had claimed them long before men arrived. Crocodiles lurked in some waters of the Nile's desert fringes, while serpents basked near hidden springs. Imagine stumbling upon salvation after days of thirst, only to discover that the water shimmered with movement, its guardians ready to strike. To approach meant risking life, to turn away meant certain death. For ancient travelers, water was never just water. It was a gamble against the unknown. The unpredictability of these encounters created a constant strain. Every step in the sand, every movement in the dark, carried the possibility of danger. A hand reaching for a jar, a child stepping barefoot on warm ground, a man falling asleep without checking his blanket. All could trigger disaster. The desert did not allow carelessness, and animals were the reminders of its law. To cross its expanse was to live in constant tension, knowing that while raiders might strike in numbers, the creatures of the desert struck in silence without warning. And yet, for all the dread inspired by these beasts, the desert's greatest enemy was still not of flesh or claw. For even when men survived snakes, scorpions, hyenas, and lions, they could not escape the invisible enemy that pressed down every hour of the day. It was not something they could fight or bribe, not something they could guard against with spears or fire. It was the heat itself, relentless and all-consuming, a force that drained the body more surely than venom and broke the will more completely than fear. The desert was a prison of fire, and its deadliest weapon was not the bandit's blade, nor the snake's venom, but the heat itself. Day after day, the sun struck without mercy, turning every stone into a brand and every breath into a furnace. Ancient travelers spoke of it not simply as weather, but as a living enemy, an invisible force that stalked every step, stripping men of their strength, their reason, and finally their will to live. Unlike raiders or wild beasts, there was no defense against it. You could not bargain with the sun, you could only endure it or perish beneath it. Heat in the desert was not like heat in any other land. It did not only scorch the skin, it sank deeper, burning into the bones and cooking the body from within. Sweat evaporated the instant it appeared, leaving no relief, no cooling, only a thirst that grew heavier by the hour. Travelers often described their tongues swelling in their mouths until speech became impossible, their throats so dry that even swallowing felt like swallowing glass. Lips cracked and bled, eyes grew red and swollen, and even the strongest men stumbled like children drunk on exhaustion. Heat stroke was not understood in the language of science then, but it was feared like a curse from the gods. To lose a man to the heat was to watch him unravel slowly, his mind first, then his body, until he collapsed face first in the sand and never rose again. Camels and animals, the very lifelines of caravans, suffered too. Though they were creatures born to endure such climates, even they could falter under the relentless sun. A camel brought down by heat meant more than the loss of cargo. It meant the loss of water skins tied to its back, the loss of movement, the loss of hope. Ancient chronicles tell of merchants who slit the bellies of dying camels to retrieve the little moisture left inside their stomachs, desperate enough to drink what no man would touch in times of plenty. Heat drove men to horrors they never imagined possible. The psychological torment was just as destructive as the physical. When the sun loomed above, days blurred together in a haze of suffering. Shadows shortened until they disappeared, leaving travelers stripped of even the illusion of shelter. The horizon shimmered with mirages, tricking men into believing salvation was near. Whole groups broke apart, chasing phantom lakes, their bodies later found scattered and dry, their hands still cupped as though holding water that never existed. These visions were so common that they became part of desert folklore, warnings passed down from elders to remind the young not to trust their eyes when the sun burned hottest. Yet even knowing the truth, men still ran, because thirst bends reason more easily than steel. To fight the heat, travelers devised routines of survival. Many caravans marched by night, when the ground cooled enough to walk without burning feet, and rested by day in shallow pits dug into the sand, hoping to trap a pocket of cooler air. Cloaks were wrapped tightly, not only to shield from the sun, but to slow the body's loss of moisture. Yet these methods were fragile. A single storm, a delay, a broken water skin, and the balance tipped toward death. The desert always waited for a mistake. In some cultures, heat itself became personified as a divine trial. Egyptian texts sometimes spoke of the sun, god Ra, not only as a bringer of life, but as a tester of men, separating the worthy from the weak by exposing them to the harshness of the desert. Nomadic tribes told stories of spirits that walked in the glare of noon, luring the thirsty away from the path. Such myths reveal the deep fear that heat inspired. It was not simply a natural force, it was a presence, a constant reminder that man was a fragile intruder in a land ruled by fire. And yet, the cruelty of the heat was only half the story. For when the sun finally sank and the relief of darkness came, the desert revealed another face of torment. The temperature plummeted, and those who had begged for shade all day now begged for warmth. The contrast shattered the body, weakening it further so that even those who survived the day entered the night already broken. The cycle of fire and frost ground men down like stones under a mill until there was nothing left to give. This cycle of destruction made men long for the one thing that could tip the scales in their favor: direction. For in the middle of the desert, where heat and cold punished without pause, survival depended not only on endurance, but on knowing where to go. A single error of judgment, one path mistaken for another, could mean weeks lost in an endless sea of dunes. And so, as men clung to life beneath the burning sun, they looked to the stars, to ancient guides, and to the fragile hope that someone among them could lead them out of the wasteland before it was too late. In the desert, survival was not only about endurance, but also about orientation. A man could withstand thirst a little longer. He could force his body through the furnace of the sun and the frost of the night, but if he lost the way, all was lost. The greatest cruelty of the sands was their sameness. Dunes shifted with the winds, wiping away every trace of footprints, turning yesterday's path into a new trap. To the untrained eye, the desert was a circle without end, where every direction looked the same, and every horizon shimmered with lies. In antiquity, this problem was far worse, for maps were crude and unreliable, and compasses had not yet been conceived. The only tools available were instinct, memory, and the sky above. Caravan leaders, often men who had inherited knowledge from fathers and grandfathers, became living maps. They carried in their minds the distances between wells, the shape of certain hills, the rhythm of days it took to move between one oasis and another. They memorized the stars and used the constellations as their compass, reading them like lines written by the gods. At night, the North Star was a faithful anchor, but clouds could hide it, and sandstorms could throw entire groups off course. A leader's mistake was fatal. One wrong turn, and a caravan could spend weeks wandering, draining its supplies until bones were left scattered across dunes as grim warnings to others. Ancient writers often told of men who became mad in the face of endless dunes. Soldiers following Alexander the Great across the Gedrosian Desert described how the landscape swallowed direction itself, how mirages tricked them into marching circles. In some cases, guides betrayed caravans, leading them into empty wastelands on purpose, either out of vengeance or in exchange for gold from rival merchants. Trust was fragile in the desert, and every step was taken with the fear that the man leading you might not know the way after all. The ingenuity of desert peoples, however, was remarkable. Bedouins and nomads developed an almost supernatural sense of orientation. They read the wind, observing how it shaped the crests of dunes. They studied the flight of birds, knowing which species signaled nearby water or which disappeared into emptiness. Even the color of the sand revealed secrets. Darker hues meant possible moisture below, while pale stretches warned of dead ground. These techniques passed from generation to generation, spoken not in books, but in stories, chants, and rituals, so that even children grew up learning how to read the language of the desert. For merchants, direction was wealth. Trade routes like the Incense Road, the Silk Road's desert passages, or the caravan paths across the Sahara were not random. They were carefully charted lifelines. Along these invisible highways, landmarks became sacred. A solitary rock, a carved pillar, a shrine built at a crossroads. Some of these markers still stand today, proof that men, desperate to impose order on chaos, left signs for those who would follow. Yet the desert was not static. Storms buried landmarks, shifting dunes erased familiar shapes, and what was once a reliable point of reference could vanish overnight. Thus, memory alone was not enough. Travelers needed faith, faith in their leaders, faith in the stars, and faith that the gods themselves would guide their steps. Losing the way was one of the deepest fears etched into the hearts of ancient travelers. To wander without direction meant watching supplies dwindle, water evaporate, and hope dissolve. Accounts from Roman expeditions into Africa describe soldiers who, realizing they had been led astray, began discarding their shields, armor, and even weapons just to lighten the load, their minds consumed by despair. Some stripped themselves of clothes, delirious in the heat, walking naked under the sun until they collapsed. Getting lost was not simply a logistical failure, it was the unraveling of the human spirit. And yet, direction was not always about reaching safety. Sometimes it was about reaching wealth. Caravans did not march across hellish wastelands for the sake of endurance. They did it for what lay beyond. Spices, silk, gold, incense, ivory, these treasures demanded passage through death itself. A merchant who reached the other side was transformed into a man of fortune, his name carved into the memory of cities that thrived on trade. In this sense, the struggle against disorientation was not only about survival, but about ambition. Each step toward an unseen horizon was also a step toward riches, toward the building of civilizations that grew out of desert crossings. But even when the stars shone clear and the guides held steady, there remained one enemy that no map, no landmark, no constellation could prevent. It was a force that erased paths, swallowed men, and buried entire caravans in silence. Travelers called it the desert's breath, a storm of sand so sudden and violent that it could erase direction, suffocate the lungs, and transform a trail into a grave in the span of minutes. The desert was already a world of hardship, but nothing tested human endurance more suddenly and violently than the storms of sand that rose without warning. To those who had never seen one, a sandstorm might seem like a simple gust of wind, a shifting of dust. In truth, it was a wall of death that moved with the speed of a predator and the power of an army. Ancient travelers called them by many names. Some saw them as curses of the gods, others as demons of the desert unleashed, but all agreed on one thing. When the horizon darkened with a rising cloud of sand, survival was no longer guaranteed. The first sign was often silence. The desert, normally filled with the low hum of wind, the creak of camel harnesses, the shuffle of feet, grew unnaturally still. Then came a low rumble, like distant thunder, though no clouds were in the sky. Men would squint into the horizon and see it, a line of darkness growing taller, stretching from one end of the earth to the other until it looked like the desert itself was lifting into the sky. Some sandstorms rose hundreds of feet high, blotting out the sun and turning day into night. For a caravan, already weakened by thirst and exhaustion, this was terror made real. When the storm hit, it was like being swallowed alive. Winds roared with such force that men were thrown to the ground, their cries stolen by the howl of moving sand. The air turned to grit, filling mouths, ears, and nostrils, suffocating anyone who did not cover themselves quickly enough. Travelers wrapped their faces in cloth, pressed themselves against the earth, and prayed. But even those precautions could fail, because sandstorms did not only attack the lungs, they erased the world. Visibility shrank to nothing. Companions only a few steps away vanished into the swirling chaos, lost like ships swallowed by a black sea. Many never found their way back. Ancient records speak of entire armies undone by storms. The Persian army of Cambyses II, marching toward the Siwa oasis in Egypt, is said to have disappeared into the desert, consumed by a storm so massive that thousands of soldiers were buried alive, their bodies hidden forever beneath dunes. Some historians doubt the tale, but the truth is undeniable. Storms of such power could erase not only men but history itself. For merchants, losing even a handful of camels meant losing water, supplies, and survival. For armies, it meant defeat without a single arrow fired. Survivors of storms described the sensation of drowning without water. Sand filled their throats until they choked, blinded their eyes until they clawed at their own faces, and stripped their skin raw as though flayed by knives. Camels, though resilient, often panicked, breaking their tethers and stampeding into the void, carrying precious cargo with them. When the storm finally passed, the desert was unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks vanished, paths were buried, and men emerged coughing, their skin bleeding, their eyes red with grit. Some caravans wandered for weeks after a storm, unable to retrace their steps, their guides as helpless as children in the shifting wasteland. The unpredictability of these storms made them especially terrifying. They could rise in moments, giving no time to prepare, or they could stalk caravans from afar, dark clouds chasing them for hours before striking. Nomadic tribes developed strategies, digging shallow pits to bury themselves and their animals until the storm passed, or tying themselves together with ropes so that no one vanished in the blindness. Yet even with preparation, the desert always claimed its price. There were stories of children suffocated in their mother's arms, of entire herds lost, of waterskins split open and buried beneath tons of shifting sand. But sandstorms were not only destructive, they also reshaped the desert itself. A single storm could erase a road traveled for centuries, creating new dunes where there had been none, uncovering ruins buried for ages, or swallowing fresh wells beneath tons of sand. This transformation fed the legends of the desert as a living entity, one that hid its treasures when it wished and revealed them when it pleased. To cross after a storm was to step into a world remade, where nothing could be trusted, not even the ground beneath your feet. And yet, for all their horror, sandstorms carried a strange kind of beauty. Ancient poets compared them to veils of the gods, vast curtains drawn across the heavens. Some even saw them as acts of cleansing, erasing the footprints of men to remind them that they did not belong to the desert, only borrowed passage through it. But beauty was no comfort to those caught in the storm. To them, the desert was not cleansing, it was consuming. When the storm finally lifted and silence returned, men staggered to their feet, counting their dead, searching desperately for lost animals, shaking sand from every fold of their clothes. Relief mixed with despair, because though they had survived, their supplies were often ruined, their sense of direction destroyed. In those moments, caravans understood that storms were not simply obstacles, they were trials that tested whether the journey could continue at all. And as battered survivors pressed onward, they carried with them a truth that haunted every step. Even if storms could be endured, the desert was not yet finished with them. For beyond the shifting sands, past the ruin of storms, lay the rare places that offered salvation, oases where life clung to the barren land. But reaching those places meant facing another gamble, because water in the desert was never just a gift. It was temptation, conflict, and sometimes a trap. For those who dared to cross the vast emptiness, nothing in the desert carried more meaning, more weight, and more hope than the sight of water. To stumble upon an oasis after weeks of suffering was like being born again, as though the earth itself had shown mercy to those who had endured its wrath. In antiquity, oases were not simply places to drink. They were shrines of survival, centers of commerce, and sacred grounds where human life clung to the desert like a fragile flame refusing to be extinguished. Imagine a caravan stumbling forward, lips cracked, eyes bloodshot, animals staggering under loads that felt like chains. Suddenly, in the distance, green shimmered in the haze, palms swaying gently, the reflection of water sparkling like glass. At first, men feared it was only another mirage, another cruel joke played by the sun. But then, as the scent of vegetation reached their nostrils and the cries of birds rang in the still air, disbelief turned to elation. Men dropped to their knees. Some kissed the ground, others wept openly, their tears mingling with the sand. Because in the desert, water was not only salvation, it was proof that life still had a place in this wasteland. Oases varied in size and form. Some were small, no more than a single spring or shallow pool hidden between rocks. Others were vast, sustaining palm groves, crops, and even entire cities. The Siwa oasis in Egypt became famous for its Temple of Amun, where Alexander the Great himself sought recognition as a divine ruler. Palmyra in Syria grew into a wealthy city because it sat at the crossroads of caravans who relied on its waters. In the Sahara, great oases like Ghadames and Timbuktu emerged as jewels of survival, where trade, culture, and religion flourished. These places were not accidents, they were the beating hearts of desert life, and without them, the ancient routes of trade and pilgrimage would have been impossible. Yet oases were not simple gifts. They were contested, guarded, and sometimes traps for the unwary. A fresh spring could attract predators, both animal and human. Lions and hyenas often lingered near watering holes, waiting for exhausted men or animals to approach. Tribes that controlled access to an oasis demanded tribute, and sometimes enslaved or slaughtered strangers who came without permission. The promise of water, so sweet from afar, could turn to terror upon arrival. Survival in the desert was never without its price. Rituals often surrounded these places. For desert peoples, water was sacred, and oases became sites of worship and myth. Travelers left offerings, shells, coins, food, even weapons, by the edge of pools, asking the gods to protect them in the next stage of the journey. Some cultures believed spirits dwelled in the waters, guardians that could bless or curse those who drank carelessly. The palm trees themselves became symbols of divine favor, their shade and fruit gifts to the weary. Dates, which grew abundantly in oasis groves, were as valuable as water, providing sugar and energy that could sustain entire caravans. To rest under a palm, to feel the coolness of its shadow after endless days without relief, was to touch paradise. The role of oases in commerce cannot be overstated. Caravans carrying incense from Arabia, spices from India, gold from Africa, or silk from China timed their routes around these lifelines. Without them, the Silk Road and the incense route would have collapsed. Wells were dug deep, lined with stone to preserve their precious contents. Some were so important that wars were fought over them, and treaties were signed to secure access. To control an oasis was to control trade, power, and wealth. And so these patches of green became not just places of rest, but hubs of civilization rising defiantly out of the sands. But oases also carried illusions. Not every glimmer of green was salvation. Some pools were poisoned with minerals that burned the throat and sickened the body. Others dried suddenly, leaving only cracked mud and bitter disappointment. The trust placed in these rare places was often betrayed, and entire groups perished because they had counted on water that failed them. Ancient texts record how guides misled travelers into false oases, or how storms buried springs beneath dunes, erasing them from memory. To live by an oasis was a blessing, but to depend on one without certainty was to gamble with death. Even when real and abundant water demanded balance, overuse of an oasis could dry it, turning lush palms into skeletal trunks and fertile soil into dust. The ancients learned this lesson early, rationing carefully even when the pools seemed endless. The wisdom of survival taught them that in the desert, nothing was infinite, not even water. And so, the joy of arrival was tempered by discipline, for tomorrow's survival depended on today's restraint. Yet for all the fragility of oases, they remained the most powerful symbol of hope. They represented victory over despair, proof that even in the most hostile places, life could endure. The memory of cool water, of green leaves trembling in the wind, was often enough to push men forward through weeks of desolation. Caravans carried that vision in their minds, chasing it step by step across the burning sands, believing that one more horizon might bring relief. But reaching an oasis, resting in its shade and filling skins with water, did not mean the end of suffering. It only meant preparation for the next stage, for the desert would always demand its toll again. And beyond the fragile peace of these hidden havens, the road awaited, longer, harsher, filled with dangers that no amount of shade or water could erase. For those who emerged from the oasis, the desert's final trial was yet to come, and with it, the promise of rebirth at the journey's end. To reach the end of a desert crossing was to defy death itself. After weeks or months of endless sand, scorching heat, freezing nights, and the constant threats of raiders and beasts, survival was more than a physical condition. It was a spiritual rebirth. The arrival at the edge of an oasis city or a fertile valley marked not just the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new identity. Men and women who staggered out of the desert were no longer the same as those who had entered. The desert had stripped them bare, taken their strength, tested their faith, and carved scars on their bodies and souls. To survive was to be remade. Ancient accounts often describe the arrival in vivid terms. Caravans, reduced to silence during the march, would erupt in cries of joy the moment they saw the walls of a settlement shimmering in the distance. Some travelers dropped to their knees in gratitude, kissing the ground as though it were sacred. Others wept, their tears finally free to fall without fear of wasting precious water. The psychological weight of that first sight of safety was immense. To step into shade after weeks without it, to drink deeply without counting each drop, to hear the laughter of a marketplace instead of the howl of the wind, these were sensations that bordered on the miraculous. But the end of the journey was not simply relief, it was also opportunity. Merchants who survived with their goods intact became wealthy overnight. Spices from India, incense from Arabia, gold from Africa, and silks from the East were treasures that entire cities depended on. Those who carried them had not only endured the desert, they had conquered it, turning suffering into profit. Markets in Petra, Palmyra, and Timbuktu thrived because caravans were willing to gamble their lives for the chance at wealth. The desert became both the price and the proof of fortune. and every merchant's success story carried with it the echo of those who had perished along the way. For pilgrims, the arrival held a different meaning. To survive the desert was seen as proof of divine favor. Inscriptions and oral traditions often frame the crossing as a test set by the gods, a purging of weakness, a path to enlightenment through suffering. Reaching a holy city or sacred site after enduring the desert was not only the completion of a physical journey, but the fulfillment of a spiritual one. The desert, in this view, was a place where men walked close to death in order to feel closer to the divine. Survival became testimony, a story retold to children and grandchildren as proof that endurance and faith could carry a soul through the harshest of trials. Communities that lived at the edges of deserts witnessed these arrivals regularly, and they became part of their culture. Inns and markets grew around the needs of the weary. Physicians specialized in treating burns, fevers, and wounds caused by sand and sun. Religious centers welcomed travelers with rituals of purification, allowing them to cleanse not only their bodies, but their spirits. To these settled peoples, the arrival of caravans was both a blessing and a reminder of the cost of survival. For every caravan that limped into their gates, others had been swallowed whole by the sands, their stories ending without witness. Yet even in triumph, survivors carried the desert with them. Their skin bore the marks of exposure, darkened and cracked. Their eyes carried the red veins of constant glare. Their gait was heavy, trained by weeks of marching on shifting ground. More than that, their minds held the weight of what they had seen. Companions buried under dunes, animals left behind to die, storms that turned day into night. These memories did not fade. They became part of the traveler's identity, scars invisible but permanent. Survival was not simply freedom, it was responsibility to carry the memory of those who did not endure. And so the desert crossing came to symbolize more than hardship. It was a metaphor for life itself in the ancient world, a struggle where every moment was uncertain, where survival demanded both strength and humility, and where triumph was never permanent. Those who survived knew that the desert was not defeated. It would always remain vast and indifferent, waiting for the next caravan to test its patience. The memory of safety could never erase the knowledge of danger, and those who planned to return carried both fear and respect in equal measure. The desert shaped civilizations because it shaped the people who faced it. Cities thrived not in spite of the desert, but because of it, built on the resilience of those who endured its trials. Trade routes flourished because men were willing to gamble their lives to cross it. Religions grew deeper because people saw the desert as the ultimate test of faith. Survival in the desert was not just about reaching the other side, it was about understanding that life itself was fragile, and that every breath, every drop of water, every patch of shade was a gift. And in the end, perhaps that is why ancient stories linger with such power, because the desert was not just a landscape, but a teacher. It taught men about endurance, about fear, about greed, about faith. It taught them that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit could cling to life with a tenacity that astonished even the gods. To survive the desert was to earn not just safety, but wisdom, and to carry forward the eternal truth that every step in the sand was both a confrontation with death and a celebration of life. But even as survivors rested in the comfort of cities, filling their bellies and sleeping under roofs, they knew that the desert had not truly released them. For many, the road would call again, whether for wealth, faith, or duty, and the sands, eternal and patient, would be waiting to test them once more.